Nyla Evans was not an ordinary woman. Beneath her composed exterior and a smile that could disarm the sharpest critic lay a past filled with challenges that most would not dare to face. In her late 30s, she had already lived through more than a lifetime's worth of battles, some physical, some psychological. A former crisis negotiator and intelligence operative, Nyla had spent years walking the thin line between life and death, dealing with hostage situations, political coup, and betrayals. Now, she had retired into what most would consider a quieter life, working as a lecturer at a prestigious university while pursuing her passion for historical preservation. But as with anyone who had danced in the shadows of power and corruption, the ghosts of her past were never far behind. Tonight, Nyla was deep in the heart of her latest project. She had recently acquired a derelict 19th-century mansion on the outskirts of town. The locals called it Hurst Estate, a place rumored to harbor secrets of its own, a haven for whispers of occult rituals, disappearances, and even murder. For Nyla, though, it wasn't about the legends. The mansion represented a fresh start, a chance to immerse herself in restoring something broken and bringing it back to life, much like how she had rebuilt herself after leaving her former career behind. With its sprawling corridors, faded grandeur, and eerie ambience, the mansion was both a challenge and a refuge. It was a stormy evening, the kind where thunder rolled ominously in the distance, and rain lashed against the estate's tall, arched windows. The power had flickered multiple times, but Nyla continued to work by the soft glow of an antique oil lamp she had found during her early explorations of the property. The desk before her was littered with old blueprints, letters sealed in wax, and a leather-bound journal she had unearthed from a hidden compartment in the library. Each artifact hinted at a layered history, one that Nyla was determined to uncover. Across town, Officer Brian Kale sat in his patrol car, his mood as dark as the clouds above. Kale was a man on the edge. In his late 40s, he had spent the better part of 2 decades serving as a police officer, yet his career was far from illustrious. Known for his hot temper and questionable judgment, Kale had a history of acting on impulse, often driven by a deep-seated resentment he didn't care to examine too closely. To him, the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who followed the rules and those who didn't. And in his mind, people like Nyla, the confident, independent type, rarely fit into the first category. Kale was patrolling the area in response to a call about suspicious activity near the Hurst estate. He didn't take the call seriously at first. Most complaints in this quiet town came from nervous neighbors imagining things that weren't there. But something about this assignment struck a chord with Kale. The name Hurst alone sent a prickle down his spine, a place he had driven past dozens of times but never entered. He had heard the stories, of course, rumors of cults, hidden rooms, and unexplained deaths. But Kale didn't believe in ghosts. To him, the real danger was people, and he was certain that whoever was inside the estate that night didn't belong. By the time Kale reached the estate, the rain had intensified, and the driveway leading up to the mansion was slick with mud. He parked his squad car at an angle, the headlights casting long shadows across the overgrown gardens and crumbling statues that framed the entrance. From his vantage point, he could see the faint flicker of light through the mansion's tall windows. Someone was definitely inside. Nyla was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear the sound of Kale's boots splashing through puddles or the creak of the estate's front door as he pushed it open. The mansion's grandeur had faded with age, but its design had ensured that even in its decay, it could intimidate. High ceilings, ornate carvings, and a staircase that seemed to stretch forever upward, it was the kind of place that swallowed intruders whole. Kyle's flashlight cut through the dimness as he stepped inside, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his sidearm. His eyes darted around the room, searching for movement, for danger, for anything that would justify his unease. Upstairs, Nyla finally heard the faint echo of footsteps reverberating through the mansion's empty halls. She froze for a moment, her fingers gripping the edges of the journal she had been reading. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Someone was here. But Nyla wasn't the type to panic. Setting the journal down, she reached for her phone, only to remember that the patchy service around the estate had rendered it useless. Her mind raced as she weighed her options: confront the intruder or hide. Kale's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Police. Who's in here? His tone was sharp, demanding, and tinged with impatience. Nyla exhaled slowly. She had dealt with men like this before, men who wore authority like armor and wielded it like a weapon. Steeling herself, she stepped into the hallway, the soft glow of her oil lamp preceding her. "I'm here," she called out, her voice steady but firm. "This is private property. You have no right to be here without a warrant." Kale turned, his flashlight landing squarely on her face. He took in her calm demeanor, her poised stance, and the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Something about her irritated him. "I got a call about suspicious activity," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "Care to explain what you're doing here?" Nyla raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward the papers in her hand. "Research. I'm the owner of this property. If you'd like, I can show you the deed." But Kyle wasn't listening. His gaze drifted to the objects strewn across the desk in the room behind her: the blueprints, the journal, and an odd piece of equipment she had been using to scan the walls for hidden compartments. To him, it looked like the setup for something illicit, even dangerous. "You expect me to believe that?" he scoffed. "At a place like this? In the middle of the night?" Nyla stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "Believe whatever you want. But if you're done with your little inspection, I'd like you to leave." Kyle's temper flared at her defiance. "Watch your tone," he snapped, taking a step toward her. "You're not in a position to give orders." The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. But Nyla didn't flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms and said, "Then do what you came here to do, officer. Arrest me or leave. But I won't be intimidated in my own home." Kyle's hand twitched near his holster, but he stopped himself. Something about this woman, her confidence, her refusal to cower, made him hesitate. But hesitation wasn't in his nature. He was determined to assert his authority, no matter the cost. This night was only beginning, and neither of them realized just how far it would spiral out of control. The storm outside raged on, but the tension within the mansion was even more volatile. Officer Brian Kale stood in the dim hallway, his flashlight casting sharp shadows across the crumbling wallpaper and the faded grandeur of Hurst estate. Nyla Evans, standing just a few feet away, held her ground with a calm composure that only infuriated Kale further. To him, she was too self-assured, too confident for someone in what he deemed a suspicious situation. That confidence felt like a challenge, and Kale wasn't the type to back down. "Let's get something straight," Kale began, stepping closer to Nyla. "I don't care who you say you are or what papers you think you own. This place has a history, and people like you, people who think they can hide behind fancy words and excuses, are usually the ones causing trouble." Nyla tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest of smirks. "People like me," she echoed, her tone cool and measured. "That's an interesting choice of words, officer." Kale felt the blood rush to his face, but he held his ground. "Don't try to twist this around. I have every right to be here. Suspicious activity was reported, and I'm investigating. Now, why don't you make this easy and show me what you're really up to before I have to start digging myself?" Nyla sighed, glancing back toward the room she had been working in. She knew there was no reasoning with someone like Kale. He wasn't here to investigate. He was here to dominate. His body language screamed of a man who had been ignored one too many times. And now, with a badge on his chest, he was determined to make sure that no one ever ignored him again. "Fine," Nyla said, her voice calm but with a hint of resignation. "Come on, I'll show you exactly what I've been working on. Maybe then you'll leave me alone." She turned and walked back into the study, her oil lamp flickering as she moved. Kale followed closely, his flashlight bouncing off the walls and illuminating the scattered artifacts on the desk. Blueprints, aged documents, the journal, and a strange handheld scanner lay across the surface, alongside an open laptop displaying cryptic diagrams of the mansion's interior. Kale's eyes narrowed as he examined the scene. To him, it looked more like a setup for a heist than a research project. His gaze landed on the scanner, a sleek, high-tech device that seemed out of place in the decaying mansion. "What the hell is this?" Kale demanded, picking up the scanner and holding it up like a piece of evidence. "You think I'm stupid? This isn't some academic project. What are you looking for in this place? Drugs? Weapons? Something worse?" Nyla crossed her arms and let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It's a GPR scanner, ground penetrating radar. I'm using it to find structural anomalies in the walls. You know, hidden compartments, secret rooms, things you might expect to find in a place like this." Carl's grip on the scanner tightened as his paranoia grew. He glanced at the journal, flipping through its brittle pages and seeing diagrams, coded notes, and faded photographs of unfamiliar faces. To Nyla, it was just the remnants of the mansion's past. To Kale, it was damning evidence of something sinister. "This doesn't add up," Kale muttered, shaking his head. "You've got high-tech equipment, coded documents, and photos of people who don't belong here. Who are these people? Are you part of some kind of group? What are you hiding?" Nyla stepped forward, her patience wearing thin. "Those are artifacts from the estate's previous owners. If you'd bothered to do your homework instead of barging in here like some vigilante, you'd know this mansion has a history of intrigue. Smuggling, illegal dealings, secret societies, you name it, it's probably happened here. That's what I'm researching." Carl's mind raced, his thoughts clouded by suspicion and adrenaline. Her explanation was too polished, too convenient. And yet there was something about her tone, the way she stared him down without a trace of fear, that made him second-guess himself. Was she telling the truth? Or was she just a master manipulator? "Turn around," Kale barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. Nyla blinked, her expression hardening. "Excuse me?" "I said turn around," he repeated, stepping closer. His hand hovered near the grip of his sidearm, a silent but unmistakable threat. "I'm going to search you. If you've got nothing to hide, this won't take long." Nyla's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "You're out of line, officer. I've already told you what's going on here. If you want to escalate this, you'll need more than baseless accusations and a bruised ego." Carl's face twisted with anger. In one swift motion, he grabbed Nyla by the arm and forced her to turn around, roughly pinning her hands behind her back. The oil lamp wobbled on the desk, casting wild shadows across the room as Nyla struggled against his grip. "This is harassment," she snapped, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You have no right." Kale cut her off, pulling a roll of duct tape from his belt and wrapping it tightly around her wrists. "I have every right," he growled. "You think you're above the law. You think you can talk your way out of this. Not tonight." As the duct tape bit into her skin, Nyla's mind raced. This wasn't the first time she'd been restrained, but it was the first time it had happened in what was supposed to be a civilized setting. She glanced at the desk, her eyes darting toward the laptop and the scanner. If she could just distract him long enough, maybe she could get to her equipment. Kale shoved her into the chair by the desk and began rifling through her belongings with increasing aggression. He tore through the journal, tossing pages onto the floor, and yanked open a nearby drawer, spilling its contents. The more he searched, the more desperate he became, as if he needed to find anything to justify his actions. "You're making a mistake," Nyla said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "You think you're in control, but you're not. You're just digging yourself into a deeper hole." Kale ignored her, his attention drawn to the laptop screen. The diagrams of the mansion's interior glowed faintly in the dim light, displaying a series of tunnels and hidden chambers that Nyla had been mapping out. Kale's eyes widened as he took it all in, his mind spinning with wild theories. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "What are you planning to do with this? Sell it to some criminal network? Use it for a haste?" Nyla let out a slow, measured breath. "Those are maps of the estate's original design. Hidden passageways, escape routes, typical features of mansions from this era. But go ahead, keep making up stories if it makes you feel better." Kale slammed the laptop shut, his frustration boiling over. He turned to Nyla, his fists clenched at his sides. "I don't know who you are or what your game is, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. You can bet your life on that." Nyla met his glare with unwavering defiance. "Go ahead, officer. Keep digging. Just remember, when you find something, you might not like what you uncover." The storm outside seemed to roar in agreement, lightning illuminating the room in brief, blinding flashes. Kale stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of the situation. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered that he had already lost it, and the night was far from over. The air inside the mansion seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to witness the unfolding chaos. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, rain hammering against the tall, cracked windows. But inside Hurst Estate, the real storm was brewing between Nyla and Kale. Kale's flashlight flickered slightly, but his grip on it remained firm as he paced the room, his boots echoing across the wooden floorboards. His chest was still heaving, his frustration building with every passing second. Nyla sat bound to the chair, her wrists aching from the tight duct tape. Despite her situation, she maintained her composure, her gaze unwavering as Kale's every movement. This wasn't her first time facing an unhinged man in a position of power, and she knew that any sign of fear would only embolden him further. Kale stopped suddenly, turning to face her, his jaw clenched. "You're not fooling me," he said, his voice low but seething with anger. "I've seen enough criminals try to play innocent to know when someone's hiding something." Nyla tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to his barely contained rage. "I've told you everything," she replied. "If you can't handle the truth, that's on you. But this little tantrum you're throwing isn't going to get you anywhere." Kale's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching near his holster. "Tantrum," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You think this is a game? You think you can just sit there and talk to me like I'm some rookie on his first day?" Nyla shrugged as much as her restraints allowed. "What I think," she said, her tone measured, "is that you're desperately looking for a reason to justify your actions. You barged in here without a warrant, assaulted me without cause, and now you're grasping at straws to make it all seem legitimate. I'm guessing this isn't the first time you've done something like this." The comment hit a nerve, and Kyle's face flushed red with anger. He stepped closer, towering over her, his shadow stretching across the room. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped. "You don't know the pressure I'm under, the garbage I deal with every single day. People like you think you're so untouchable, hiding behind your fancy education and your smug attitude. But not tonight." Kale leaned in, his face inches from hers, the vein in his temple pulsing. Nyla held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Her calmness only seemed to infuriate him further. "Let me make something clear," he continued, his voice dropping to a growl. "You're not walking out of here until I get some answers. And if that means tearing this place apart, so be it." Kale straightened and began rummaging through her belongings again, this time with even less care. He swept the blueprints off the desk, scattering them across the floor, and knocked over the oil lamp, sending it clattering to the ground. The flame extinguished instantly, leaving the room bathed in the cold, harsh light of his flashlight. "You know what I think?" Kale said as he sifted through the papers. "I think you're not just some historian poking around in old buildings. That scanner, those diagrams, they're not for research. You're looking for something illegal." Nyla sighed, her patience wearing thin. "If you're so convinced I'm some criminal mastermind, then go ahead. Find your evidence. But all you're doing is proving how little you actually know." Kale paused, his hands hovering over the journal. He flipped it open again, his eyes scanning the pages filled with cryptic notes and sketches of the mansion's interior. One page in particular caught his attention, a diagram of a hidden room marked with the words "Vault Access." His heart raced as his mind jumped to wild conclusions. "What's this?" he demanded, holding up the journal. "Vault Access? What are you hiding in there? Drugs? Money? Weapons?" Nyla couldn't help but laugh, though it was tinged with disbelief. "You've been watching too many movies," she said. "That's just a note about the estate's architectural design. But sure, keep inventing conspiracies if it makes you feel better." Kale slammed the journal shut and threw it onto the desk. "You think this is funny?" he barked. "You think I'm just going to let you sit there and mock me?" Before Nyla could respond, Kyle's flashlight flickered again, this time dimming significantly before snapping back to full brightness. The sudden change made him pause, his eyes darting toward the shadows at the edges of the room. For a moment, the tension shifted, the atmosphere growing eerily still. "Did you see that?" Kale asked, his voice quieter now, as though he didn't want to draw attention to whatever was happening. "See what?" Nyla replied, her tone almost bored. Kale frowned, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He stepped toward the doorway, his ears straining to catch any sound beyond the storm. The wind howled outside, and the rain continued to lash against the windows, but inside the mansion, there was something else, a faint creaking, like footsteps on old wood. Kale froze, his flashlight sweeping across the hallway. "Who else is here?" he demanded, turning back to Nyla. "Who are you working with?" Nyla raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. "I told you it's just me." "Don't lie to me," Kale shouted, the veins in his neck bulging. "I heard someone. If this is some kind of setup." Another creak echoed through the mansion, this time louder, more deliberate. Kale spun around, his flashlight darting wildly across the room. For the first time since he'd arrived, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Stay here," he barked at Nyla, as though she had any choice in the matter. He stalked out of the room, his boots pounding against the floorboards, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nyla watched him go, her mind racing. Whoever or whatever was in the mansion with them, it wasn't part of her plans. She shifted in her chair, testing the strength of the duct tape binding her wrists. It held firm, but she wasn't about to give up. Taking a deep breath, she focused on the sounds around her, trying to piece together what was happening. Kale moved through the hallway, his flashlight illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the cobweb-covered chandeliers above. The creaking continued, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His pulse quickened as his mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of trick? Had he stumbled into something far bigger than he could handle? "Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the mansion. Silence. Kale gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. He turned a corner and entered a grand dining hall, the long table still set with dusty, decayed plates and glasses. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper. He scanned the room, his flashlight catching the glint of something metallic on the far end of the table. Slowly he approached, his hand hovering near his holster. As he got closer, he realized it was a knife, an ornate blade with an ivory handle, covered in a thin layer of dust. It seemed out of place, too pristine compared to the rest of the room. Kale picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, and Kale whirled around, his heart leaping into his throat. His flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette, tall and unmoving. "Who the hell are you?" Kale demanded, raising the flashlight to illuminate the figure. But there was nothing there. The doorway was empty. Kale took a step back, his breathing ragged. His grip on the knife tightened as his eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The whispers returned, louder this time, and Kyle's composure began to crack. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself. "It's just the storm, just my imagination." But deep down he wasn't so sure. Back in the study, Nyla continued to work on freeing herself. The sound of the slamming door had startled her, but it also gave her hope. Whatever was happening, it was distracting Kale, and she intended to use that to her advantage. She shifted in the chair, twisting her wrists against the tape, feeling it start to give ever so slightly. Another creak echoed through the mansion, followed by a loud crash, as though something heavy had fallen. Nyla froze, her eyes darting toward the doorway. She couldn't see Kale, but she could hear his frantic footsteps as he ran back toward her. When he burst into the room, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anger. "You think this is funny?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You think I don't know what's going on?" Nyla stared at him, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" Kale pointed the knife at her, his hand shaking. "You're working with someone. I know it. They're trying to scare me, but it's not going to work. Do you hear me? It's not going to work." Nyla leaned back in the chair, her expression calm despite the blade pointed at her. "I don't know what you're hearing," she said, "but it's not me. Maybe this place is finally getting to you." Kale's grip tightened on the knife, and for a moment, Nyla thought he might actually lose control. But then, the whispers returned, louder than ever, and Kale spun around, his flashlight darting toward the hallway. "Stay here," he muttered again, before disappearing into the shadows once more. This time, Nyla didn't hesitate. She twisted her wrists with all her strength, feeling the tape give way. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With one final effort, she freed herself, her hands aching but functional. She stood, her legs shaky but steady, and began gathering her belongings. Whatever was happening in Hurst estate, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to sit around and wait to find out. The storm outside had reached a deafening crescendo, lightning cracking through the sky in irregular bursts, illuminating the grand but decayed halls of Hurst estate. Rain pelted the windows like an ominous drumbeat, and inside the mansion, chaos was unraveling at an accelerated pace. Nyla Evans, now free from her restraints, moved swiftly and silently through the shadowy corridors. Her hands throbbed where the duct tape had bitten into her skin, but she pushed through the pain. She wasn't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. Officer Kale was still somewhere in the mansion, his paranoia feeding on itself, driving him further into a spiral of irrationality. Nyla didn't need to wait around to see what he might do next. She paused at a corner, her breath steady but her ears attuned to every sound. The distant creak of floorboards and the occasional muttered curse told her Kale was still on the move. His flashlight beam danced erratically against the walls in the distance, a visual manifestation of his fraying nerves. She could tell he was getting desperate, and that made him even more dangerous. Nyla's first thought was to retrieve her laptop and the documents he had ransacked. Those items contained not only her research but also critical information that tied the mansion's history to a larger network of corruption, a network that Kale, in his frantic state, could easily misunderstand or exploit. She knew she had to secure them before he could do any more damage. Creeping back toward the study, she froze at the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Kale's voice echoed down the hall, muttering incoherent fragments to himself. "You think you can scare me? You think I'm not onto you?" His voice rose, full of both fury and fear. "This place isn't going to break me. I'll find you. I'll figure out what you're hiding." Nyla pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She couldn't risk another direct confrontation, not when Kale was armed and unstable. Her eyes scanned the room she was in, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. A faint glimmer caught her eye, a shard of broken mirror lying on the ground near an old, overturned table. She reached down, careful to avoid making any noise, and picked it up. It wasn't much, but it was something. Kale's footsteps grew louder, and the erratic beam of his flashlight illuminated the entrance to the study. Nyla held her breath as she watched him step into the room, his posture tense, his flashlight darting across the walls and floor. He was holding the ornate knife he'd found earlier, his grip tight and his knuckles white. The veins in his neck bulged as he scanned the room, his paranoia practically oozing from his every movement. "Where are you?" he hissed, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You're not as smart as you think, hiding from me. This place can't protect you." Nyla remained perfectly still, hidden in the shadows just outside the study. She could hear the sound of papers being shuffled and objects being tossed aside as Kale tore through her belongings in search of something. He didn't even know what he was looking for anymore. He just needed something to validate the twisted narrative he had built in his head. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the mansion. The sound reverberated through the walls, sharp and jarring, like a heavy piece of furniture being toppled over. Kale froze, his flashlight jerking toward the hallway. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Nyla took the opportunity to slip further down the corridor, her movements as silent as the shadows that surrounded her. Whatever had caused the noise, it wasn't her. And it was clear that Kale was just as unsettled by it as she was. She could hear his boots pounding against the floor as he moved toward the source of the sound, his breath heavy and uneven. For a moment, Nyla considered making a break for the front door, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Even if she could get past Kale, the storm outside was ferocious, and the mansion's remote location meant there was no one nearby to help. No, her best chance was to outmaneuver him here on her own turf. As she moved further into the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker, It was as if the mansion itself was alive, feeding off the tension and fear that had taken root within its walls. Nyla shook the thought from her mind. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but she couldn't deny the unsettling horror of the place. She entered another room, this one a grand parlor with a massive fireplace and walls lined with dusty bookshelves. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mingling with the scent of aged wood. Nyla quickly scanned the room for anything she could use another potential weapon, a hiding place, anything. Her eyes landed on an old candelabra resting on the mantel above the fireplace. It was heavy, made of solid brass. She grabbed it, testing its weight in her hand. It wasn't ideal, but it would do in a pinch. Just as she was about to move on, she heard another sound, this time closer. It wasn't Carl's heavy boots or the creaking of the floorboards. It was softer, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of fabric or the faint exhale of a breath. Nyla's grip on the candelabra tightened as she turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice low but steady. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the darkness, a woman's voice, faint and melodic, yet chilling in its clarity. "You shouldn't be here." Nyla's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the shadows undisturbed. She told herself it must have been her imagination, a trick of the storm and her frayed nerves. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Kale had reached the source of the earlier crash, a massive wardrobe that had fallen over in one of the upstairs bedrooms. He stood in the doorway, his flashlight illuminating the scene. The wardrobe lay on its side, its doors flung open to reveal a collection of moth-eaten clothes and broken hangers. There was no sign of what had caused it to fall. Kale stepped into the room cautiously, his knife held at the ready. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, like the murmurs of unseen spectators. He clenched his teeth, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't real," he muttered under his breath. "It's just the storm. Just the damn storm." But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows at the far end of the room. Kale whipped around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the figure was gone. "Come out!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty room. "I'm not playing games!" Silence. Kale backed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone in the mansion. Whether it was Nyla or someone else, he couldn't say, but the thought only fueled his paranoia. Back in the parlor, Nyla was still trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She moved to one of the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of the old, dusty volumes. Many of the titles were faded beyond recognition, but one in particular caught her attention, a thick, leather-bound book with no title on the spine. She pulled it from the shelf, the weight of it surprising her. As she opened the book, a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Nyla picked it up, her brow furrowing as she unfolded it. The paper was covered in handwritten notes, along with a crude map of the mansion. Certain rooms were marked with X's, and one phrase was scrawled across the bottom in bold letters: "The truth is buried below." Nyla stared at the paper, her mind racing. She didn't know who had written it or when, but one thing was clear: the secrets of Hurst estate ran deeper than she had realized. In the distance, she heard Kale shouting again, his voice raw with anger and fear. She knew she didn't have much time. Clutching the map tightly, she made her way toward the stairs that led to the mansion's lower levels. If the truth was buried below, she intended to find it before Kale's madness consumed them both. What neither of them knew, however, was that something else was waiting for them in the depths of the mansion, something that neither logic nor fear could fully explain. The storm outside Hurst estate intensified, each bolt of lightning slashing through the darkness and briefly illuminating the vast, decaying mansion. Inside, the battle between logic and madness, control and survival, reached new and terrifying heights. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the walls themselves seem to tremble. Nyla Evans had descended into the mansion's depths, clutching the map she had found in the old book, her resolve sharpening with every step. Behind her, Officer Brian Kale stumbled through the hallways above, his flashlight flickering erratically as he fought to maintain a grip on his crumbling reality. Nyla had managed to navigate through the labyrinthine passages of the mansion to a set of stairs she hadn't noticed before. They were hidden behind a heavy, dust-covered tapestry, which she had pulled aside after seeing it marked on the map. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading down into the bowels of the house. The faint smell of damp earth and decay wafted up to meet her as she descended, each step creaking under her weight. She held the brass candelabra tightly in one hand, the other clutching the map. The cryptic note scrawled at the bottom of the map, "The truth is buried below," echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She didn't know what she would find in the depths of the estate, but she had to keep moving. Kale was spiraling into dangerous paranoia, and the longer she stayed within his reach, the higher the risk of his unraveling turning deadly. Meanwhile, upstairs, Kale was losing the last vestiges of his composure. He moved through the mansion like a predator cornered by its own fears, his flashlight's beam jittering across the walls. The whispers he had been hearing were growing louder, more insistent, and they no longer seemed to come from a single direction. He would spin around, certain he had caught movement out of the corner of his eye, only to find nothing but shadows. "You think you can mess with me?" Kale growled, his voice echoing off the cracked plaster walls. He gripped the ornate knife he had taken earlier, his knuckles white. "You're not getting away with this. You hear me? You're not smarter than me." His words sounded hollow, even to him, but they were all he had left to hold on to. He no longer cared if Nyla was alone or if she had accomplices. He just needed to find her, to prove to himself that he wasn't losing control. Kale stopped abruptly in front of the fireplace in the grand parlor, the one Nyla had passed through earlier. Something about it caught his attention. The mantel was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for one small, circular spot where it had been wiped clean. His eyes narrowed as he approached, shining his flashlight across the mantel. There, in the dust, he saw faint traces of fingerprints leading toward the side of the fireplace. He crouched down, running his fingers along the bricks, and felt a faint draft seeping through the cracks. "A hidden passage," he muttered, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Of course." Kale pressed against the bricks, searching for a lever or mechanism. It took a few moments, but he finally found a loose brick that, when pushed, triggered a low, grinding sound. The side panel of the fireplace slid open, revealing a dark, narrow corridor beyond. Kale straightened up, the grin on his face widening. "Gotcha," he said under his breath, stepping into the passage. The corridor was claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to press inward as Kale moved deeper into the mansion's hidden underbelly. His flashlight flickered again, the beam bouncing off damp stone walls. The air was colder here, and the smell of earth was stronger, mingling with something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. Kale couldn't place it, but it made his stomach churn. As he advanced, he became aware of the sound of footsteps echoing faintly ahead of him. They were soft, deliberate, and they stopped abruptly whenever he paused to listen. It wasn't Nyla, he was sure of that. These footsteps belonged to someone else, someone who knew these corridors better than he did. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice reverberating through the passage. "Come out, show yourself." Silence. Kale's grip on the knife tightened as he continued forward, his every nerve on edge. The whispers he had heard earlier seemed to follow him, growing louder with each step. They weren't words, at least. Not in any language he recognized, but they were insistent, like the murmurs of a crowd watching from the shadows. Nyla, meanwhile, had reached the bottom of the hidden staircase and found herself in a cavernous underground chamber. The room was vast, with stone walls that glistened with moisture and a high ceiling supported by ancient wooden beams. At the center of the chamber was a large circular stone slab, its surface etched with intricate symbols and markings that Nyla couldn't decipher. Surrounding the slab were several wooden crates, some open and spilling their contents: yellowed documents, rusted tools, and what appeared to be old, decayed weaponry. She approached the slab cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The map had led her here, but she still didn't know what she was looking for. As she examined the symbols on the slab, she noticed a faint groove running along its edge, as though it were designed to move or open. She knelt down, running her fingers along the groove, and felt the faint vibration of something mechanical beneath the stone. Before she could investigate further, she heard a noise behind her, the sound of a door or panel creaking open. Nyla spun around, raising the candelabra defensively, and saw the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. Kale stepped into the chamber, his knife gleaming in the light, his face a mask of fury and determination. He froze for a moment when he saw her standing by the stone slab, his eyes narrowing. "Thought you could hide down here?" "Huh?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What the hell is this place? What are you doing down here?" Nyla took a step back, holding the candelabra tightly. "I don't know what you think you've found, but you need to stop. This is bigger than you, and you're not prepared for it." Kale laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Bigger than me? Don't make me laugh. I've seen your little maps and your toys. You think you can play me? I know exactly what this is, some kind of smuggling operation, isn't it? Or maybe something worse. What's buried under that slab, huh? Drugs? Bodies?" Nyla shook her head, her eyes locking onto his. "You're out of your depth, Kale. Whatever you think you're going to find down here, it's not what you expect. Don't you dare talk down to me." Kale snapped, stepping closer. "You don't get to act like you're smarter than me. You're just another criminal trying to outsmart the system, and I'm here to put a stop to it." He lunged forward, swiping at her with the knife. Nyla dodged to the side, swinging the candelabra with all her strength. The heavy brass struck Kale's forearm, and he let out a pained grunt, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the chamber as it hit the ground, plunging parts of the room into darkness. Kale recovered quickly, his free hand grabbing Nyla by the arm and shoving her against the slab. The stone was cold against her back as she struggled to break free, her heart pounding. Kale raised the knife again, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can stop me?" he growled. "You're done. You hear me? Done." Before he could bring the knife down, a low rumbling sound filled the chamber. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The stone slab beneath them began to vibrate, the symbols glowing faintly with an eerie greenish light. "What the hell?" Kale muttered, his grip on Nyla loosening as he stared at the glowing slab. The rumbling grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet shook violently. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the entire chamber seemed to come alive. Kale stumbled back, his knife falling from his hand as he tried to steady himself. Nyla took the opportunity to grab the flashlight and shine it across the room. What she saw made her blood run cold. The crates surrounding the slab had been disturbed by the vibrations, their contents spilling out further. Among the scattered documents and tools were bones, human bones, their edges jagged and blackened as though they had been burned. Kale saw them too, his face going pale. For the first time since he had arrived at the mansion, the bravado and arrogance drained from his expression, replaced by something far more primal: fear. What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nyla didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was buried below, and now it was starting to rise. The mansion groaned as if alive, the deep rumbling emanating from the stone slab in the center of the underground chamber. Dust and debris cascaded from the ceiling, caught in the erratic beam of Nyla's flashlight. The ancient symbols on the slab pulsed with an unnatural green glow, their light casting twisted shadows across the damp stone walls. Nyla stood frozen, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand and the brass candelabra in the other. Across from her, Kale was equally stunned, his wide eyes fixed on the glowing slab. "What the hell is this?" Kale muttered, his voice trembling. His bravado had vanished, replaced by a raw, unguarded fear. The ornate knife lay forgotten at his feet, the rumbling vibrations having rattled it from his hand. Nyla's mind raced as she pieced together fragments of the mansion's history. The cryptic map, the warnings etched into the slab, the journal's references to forbidden rituals, it all pointed to something deeply sinister, something buried here long ago. She took a cautious step back from the slab, her instincts screaming that whatever was happening was far beyond anything she had anticipated. Kale, however, was spiraling into denial. "You did this," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly off the chamber's walls. He pointed a shaking finger at Nyla, his anger flaring as a desperate defense against his fear. "What the hell are you messing with down here? Some kind of bomb? A weapon?" Nyla turned to him, her expression steely. "You're still thinking too small, Kale. This isn't some petty smuggling ring or criminal operation. Whatever's under that slab, it's older than either of us, and it's waking up." Kyle's face twisted with rage, his fear fueling his aggression. "Shut up," he barked, lunging toward her. "You don't get to act like you're in control. Not anymore." Nyla dodged him, her movements sharp and deliberate. Kale stumbled, his boots skidding on the damp stone floor as he crashed against one of the crates. Its contents spilled onto the ground, more bones, charred and broken, along with rusted chains and ceremonial daggers. Kale recoiled in horror, his hand trembling as he shoved himself away from the grim relics. The rumbling intensified, the vibrations spreading through the chamber like a heartbeat. The slab's glow grew brighter, illuminating the entire room with a sickly green light. Cracks began to form along its surface, jagged and uneven, releasing faint tendrils of smoke that coiled upward like grasping fingers. Nyla's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave without answers. Whatever was buried beneath the slab had ties to the mansion's dark history, and perhaps even to the network of corruption she had been investigating. She stepped closer, her flashlight trained on the cracks as she searched for any sign of what lay below. Kale, still shaken, scrambled to his feet. His rage gave way to panic as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "We have to seal this place up," he said, his voice unsteady. "We can't let this thing out." Nyla turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You're the one who's been tearing through this place without any understanding of what you were dealing with. Now you want to play hero." Kale opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, a deafening crack split the air. The slab shattered, sending shards of stone flying in every direction. Nyla threw herself to the ground, covering her head as the debris rained down around her. Kale did the same, cursing under his breath as he shielded his face. When the dust began to settle, Nyla cautiously lifted her head. The slab was gone, reduced to rubble, and in its place was a gaping pit that seemed to descend into endless darkness. From the depths of the pit came a low, guttural sound, a growl that reverberated through the chamber like the roar of an ancient beast. Kale scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growl. Nyla didn't answer. She couldn't. Her flashlight flickered as she directed it toward the pit, the beam barely penetrating the inky blackness. The air around the pit was colder now, the chill sinking into her bones. She felt a primal, instinctive fear rising within her, a deep-seated terror that she couldn't explain. Then, something moved. At first, it was just a faint shimmer, like a heat wave distorting the air above the pit. But as Nyla watched, the shimmer grew more defined, taking on a shape that defied logic. It was massive, its form constantly shifting and writhing, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its surface glistened like oil, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with a malevolent, otherworldly light. Kale let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling as he fell to the ground. This isn't real," he stammered, his voice breaking. "It can't be real." Nyla's grip on the candelabra tightened as she forced herself to stand. Her rational mind screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but another part of her, the part that had faced countless dangers before, refused to back down. The creature emitted another growl, its sound like 1,000 voices layered over one another, each one dripping with malice. It began to rise from the pit, its amorphous body stretching and expanding as it pulled itself into the chamber. The walls seemed to shake in protest, the beams above groaning under the weight of its presence. Kale scrambled to his feet, his knife forgotten on the ground. "We have to stop it," he shouted, his voice trembling. "We have to." Before he could finish, the creature lashed out. One of its tendrils shot forward with terrifying speed, striking Kale and sending him flying across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the ground, motionless. "Kale!" Nyla shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. She knew he had been her adversary, but in this moment he was still human, and whatever this thing was, it was a threat to them both. The creature turned its attention to her, its burning eyes locking onto her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Nyla took a step back, her mind racing. She glanced around the chamber, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on one of the ceremonial daggers lying amidst the spilled contents of the crates. Without hesitation, she dove for the dagger, her fingers closing around its hilt just as the creature lunged toward her. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the tendril that struck the ground where she had been standing moments before. The impact sent a shockwave through the floor, cracking the stone beneath her feet. Nyla scrambled to her feet, the dagger clutched tightly in her hand. The blade was ancient, its edge worn but still sharp. Symbols etched into the metal glowed faintly as she held it, pulsing with the same eerie light that had emanated from the slab. The creature hesitated, its tendrils twitching as if in recognition of the weapon. Nyla took a deep breath, her grip steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She raised the dagger, the glowing symbols casting a faint light across the chamber. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "And you're not leaving this place." The creature growled again, its form shifting and writhing as it prepared to strike. Nyla braced herself, her muscles coiled like a spring. When the tendril lashed out, she moved with precision, dodging its attack and plunging the dagger into its glistening surface. The creature let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing as the blade pierced it. The glowing symbols flared brightly, searing the air with an intense heat. The tendril recoiled, and the creature began to retreat, its form flickering and destabilizing as if the dagger's touch had disrupted its existence. Nyla didn't relent. She pulled the dagger free and struck again, driving the blade into the creature's core. Each strike was met with a blinding flash of light and a guttural scream that shook the very foundations of the chamber. Finally, with one last roar, the creature collapsed into itself, its body imploding into a vortex of light and shadow. The pit swallowed it whole, the rumbling subsiding as the glow faded from the chamber. Nyla stood in the silence that followed, her chest heaving as she clutched the dagger. The chamber was still once more. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence lifted. She turned to where Kale lay slumped against the wall, his face pale but his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The storm outside had begun to wane, the rain softening to a steady patter. But inside Hollowhurst Estate, the scars of what had transpired remained a chilling reminder of the darkness buried beneath its surface. The mansion was silent now, save for the faint drip of water leaking through cracks in the stone ceiling. The oppressive weight that had filled the air during the encounter with the creature was gone, leaving behind a haunting stillness. Nyla Evans leaned against the rough stone wall of the underground chamber, her body trembling from exhaustion but her mind racing. She clutched the ceremonial dagger, its faintly glowing symbols dimming now that the creature had been vanquished. Across the room, Officer Brian Kale stirred, groaning in pain as he attempted to push himself upright. His face was pale, and a dark bruise was spreading across his temple where he had struck the wall. His bravado had vanished completely, replaced by a hollow, dazed look in his eyes. He glanced at Nyla, his expression a mixture of fear, shame, and lingering disbelief. What the hell just happened? Kale rasped, his voice barely audible. Nyla straightened, her grip on the dagger tightening instinctively as she took a step toward him. For a moment, she considered leaving him there, letting him deal with the weight of his own arrogance and the horrors he had unleashed. But something inside her refused. He was reckless, dangerous even, but no one deserved to face this alone. "You saw it," she said, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "You can't deny what it was. You opened the door to something you didn't understand, and we're lucky to be alive." Kale shook his head weakly, his hand clutching his side as he winced. This isn't real. It can't be real." His words were desperate, but there was no conviction behind them. "It is real," Nyla replied, her tone sharp. "And now you have to live with it. You ignored every warning, dismissed every sign, and now you've seen the consequences. That thing, whatever it was, is part of something much bigger than you or me." Kale leaned back against the wall, his breathing shallow as his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed. For the first time since their confrontation began, he looked small, stripped of the false authority and bluster that had fueled his actions. Nyla felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define, pity, perhaps, or a grudging sense of justice finally served. The ground beneath them groaned faintly, a final reminder of the devastation the creature had caused. Nyla glanced at the remnants of the shattered slab and the dark pit it had revealed. Though the creature was gone, she couldn't shake the feeling that its presence lingered in some unseen way. The mansion, once just a project for her research, now felt like a living thing, a repository for centuries of secrets and sins. "We need to seal this place," Nyla said finally, turning her attention back to Kale. "If that thing came from here, there's no telling what else might be buried below." Kale let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Seal it? How? With what? You saw what it did. Nothing we have is strong enough to contain something like that. Nyla stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she crouched down, retrieving a handful of the broken stones from the slab. The symbols etched into them still pulsed faintly with an eerie light. She held them up, her eyes narrowing. "These were meant to keep it contained," she said. "Whoever built this place knew what they were dealing with. They just didn't account for someone like you stumbling in and tearing it apart." Kale flinched at the accusation, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pushed himself to his feet with a groan, swaying slightly before regaining his balance. "So, what now? You just throw some rocks over it and hope for the best." Nyla didn't dignify the question with an answer. Instead, she began gathering the stones, arranging them in a rough circle around the pit. She worked quickly but deliberately, her movements guided more by instinct than knowledge. Kale watched her in silence, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him like a physical force. When the circle was complete, Nyla stepped back, her chest heaving from the effort. She placed the ceremonial dagger in the center of the circle, its glowing symbols pulsing faintly, as if acknowledging the task it had been given. The air around the pit seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier, but the rumbling vibrations subsided. The chamber fell into an uneasy stillness once more. Nyla turned to Kale, her expression stern. "This place is a tomb now. No one goes near it again. Do you understand me?" Kyle nodded numbly, his eyes fixed on the glowing circle of stones. He looked like a man who had aged decades in the span of hours, his confidence shattered and his arrogance replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. As they made their way back up the hidden staircase, the weight of what had transpired settled over them like a shroud. The mansion seemed darker now, its corridors stretching endlessly into shadow. Nyla kept her grip on the flashlight, her senses on high alert for any sign of lingering danger. Kale followed behind her, his steps heavy and unsteady. When they finally emerged into the main part of the mansion, the storm outside had begun to abate. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the wind no longer howled through the broken windows. The quiet was almost unsettling after the chaos they had endured. Kale stopped in the doorway to the study, his gaze sweeping over the scattered papers, the overturned furniture, and the remnants of his earlier rampage. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't even know what to write in my report," he said, his voice tinged with self-loathing. "What am I supposed to say? That we fought a monster. That it came out of a hole in the ground." "You won't write anything," Nyla said firmly, turning to face him. "You'll leave this place out of your report entirely. No one can know what happened here. If word gets out, people will come looking. They'll dig, and they'll unleash something worse." Kale stared at her, his face pale. "You expect me to just pretend this never happened?" "Yes," Nyla said without hesitation, "because the alternative is worse, much worse." Kale opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Nyla's eyes silenced him. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had caused enough damage already, he didn't need to add to it. As Nyla stepped outside into the damp night air, she paused on the mansion's front steps, looking back at the hulking structure. Hurst estate loomed against the dark sky, its silhouette jagged and menacing. It was no longer just a project for her research, it was a warning, a testament to the consequences of hubris and ignorance. Kale lingered behind her, his hands shoved into his pockets as he stared at the ground. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice subdued. Nyla didn't look at him as she replied. "You go back to your life and try to be better, and I'll make sure this place stays buried." Kale didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked away, disappearing into the night without another word. Nyla watched him go, her expression unreadable. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Nyla turned back to the mansion one last time. She knew the battle was over, but the war was far from won. Hollowhurst Estate held secrets that were better left undisturbed, and she had taken it upon herself to ensure they stayed that way. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. With a resolute sigh, she walked down the mansion's overgrown path, the weight of her newfound responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders.